Great, okay, so it looks like most people are connected now. That's wonderful. So welcome everybody to this month's Senior Social. You're here again with Team Lauren. So I'm Lauren Spring, of course, and there's my colleague in the other box.
Hi there.
Also Lauren Renzetti. So just for those of you who've been there before, you know how it works already, that today we're gonna discuss 2 works of art, and then Lauren's gonna guide us through an art making component as well. And we'll review some of the materials that hopefully you'll have on hand, and if not, you can improvise with what you do have. And so we have about an hour together to do all of this. And we're gonna be focusing today on contemporary art. And we have 2 really interesting installation pieces that we'll look at together that I think are going to spark a lot of conversations and hopefully insights and questions. Both of them are really quite provocative works. They're both pieces that back in the day when we were doing tours in person, you know, I'd come with a group and we'd round a corner and we'd see one of these pieces, and they're both ones that spark very visceral reactions, and people seem to think like, what's going on here? So I'm excited to share them with you and to hear what you think, because this group is usually very lively and has lots of great stuff to say and ask. So for those who haven't been here before too, a good thing to know is that it is very interactive. We want to hear your voices and your questions and everything. And there's multiple ways you can do this. If you'd like to unmute yourself and respond with your lovely voice, we'd love to hear it. Otherwise, you can also type into the chat. That's totally fine too. And Lauren and I will both have that open. So either option is great. Here is a photograph of our beloved Art Gallery of Ontario. So located in downtown Toronto. I imagine some of you might be living and working and joining us from downtown Toronto as well, but others might be from a greater distance. Anyone want to share where they're from if outside Toronto?
Yeah, I'm in Ajax, Camille. I'm in Ajax.
Wonderful. We've got Camille from Ajax. Beautiful.
I'm Janet, and I'm calling from Cranbrook, BC.
Oh, wow. Okay, look at that. So Lauren, it is morning sun here.
It's noon here. I'm on mountain time, actually, where we live. We live in the Rockies, so.
Beautiful. Oh my goodness. That's great. And in the chat here, we've got Carol from London, Ontario. Wonderful. We've got a bit of a cross-country representation here, even if a little Ontario focused. So those of you who do live near the AGO, the good news is that the museum is open again now if you want to visit in person. We've got some really excellent exhibitions on, some temporary ones, and then of course our regular permanent collection, where there's always lots to see too. I'll also take a moment to acknowledge that the land the AGO is on is Mississauga territory, Mississauga. It is also governed by a treaty between the Mississauga of the Credit and the Canadian government. Toronto is Mississauga territory. It has also been occupied by other Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat Confederacy. All right, so let's launch right into it, folks. This is the first piece that Lauren and I selected to share with you. And it is important to know, obviously we're looking at a photograph of it, but if you were to see this work in person, it would take up basically an entire gallery space. So this is what we call installation art, where it's not a simple sculpture that's, you know, on a plinth or, you know, in a corner of a room. Not a painting hanging on a wall, obviously. This is really one that you could walk all the way around, and it's meant to be installed in a certain space and take up a lot of that space. So why don't we share some of our initial reactions? It could be observations like what you see going on here. Might also be how you feel looking at this piece. What do folks think?
I see some physics in it.
Can you expand?
In the foundation, the X stuff, it's called truss. You use it to build buildings and bridges.
It sounds like you might have a background in physics or engineering or something. Is that true?
No, just a science girl. No, but I just saw that immediately when I look at it.
Great, beautiful. Yeah, so some physics involved here. Obviously, kind of some architectural elements that we've probably seen other places before. So interesting to note, right? Because it's actually quite sturdy, and it is, you know, representing, strong architecture that you would see in a public space. But here, slightly different purpose. In the chat here, Margaret says she's imagining a fun dream. Robin, the roller coaster of life. Cindy, it looks like fun, a really fun ride. Roller coaster of a dream. Reminds me of MC Escher paintings. Cool.
I see life.
Life.
I see lives resting, and the trials and the travelings and the journey of life.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, there's certainly often that metaphor, right? That, you know, life is a roller coaster, the roller coaster of life. I have a feeling that probably in the past 2 years, many of us have felt all sorts of different emotions and had high lows of pandemic life. And so maybe are more, because it was a time, you know, of less like out global travel and sort of deeper internal travel. Many of us are maybe more in touch with our own feelings, and we didn't have too many other distractions away from what we were going through. So yeah, I think certainly it could represent life. Susan here is saying, yeah, journey to a good night's sleep. Yeah, it could also be read almost more literally like that too, that if you think, okay, here's a roller coaster and a bed combined. We do know, science tells us, sleep science tells us that, you know, throughout every night, even if you feel like you sleep the whole way through, obviously, there's moments that are, you know, deeper sleep, sort of rapid eye movement, deeper sleep where your dreams really happen. Other moments that, you know, your body's resting and muscles are repairing and everything. So could actually represent the sleep cycle in some sort of way. And Cindy is mentioning too here, yeah, the pink color. That's a really great point, I think, because if this were another color, say bright red, or who knows, maybe gold or something, the mood of the piece would be quite different. So let's focus a bit on the pink here. What does the pink make you feel? And maybe also, why do you think the artists in this case decided on pink?
I think it's restful, and it kind of ties in with the bed, kind of sleeping mode, dreams, like what somebody else said. So I think it ties into that, the calmness of it.
Nicely said. Yeah, it is. I guess, yeah, to describe it, this one would be sort of a soft pink, right? It's not that bright bubblegum, it's loud pink, but yeah, I see what you mean, associating with calm. There's also some great words here: organic energy, love, embraces comfort, restful and soft. Yeah, kind of reminds me, you know, I have a young daughter. She just was given lots of sort of baby blankets this color. So Courtney has something interesting here to say, that the general idea here is maybe overrated. Courtney, would you care to expand on that? How you think that the work doesn't maybe age or wear well?
Well, the artist was general idea, the group. And right?
This one is actually by a different, it looks a lot like a general idea piece. And it's interesting because this is also done by a collective, much like general idea. But it's actually a group from Cuba called Los Carpinteros, this one.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just feel that it's, you know, it was responding to the situation with the gay rights movement. And it was important at the time to bring attention to that. But I find the work kind of, I can't think of a nice way to put it, a little simplistic. It doesn't really resonate with me.
Okay, yeah, and for those who don't know General Idea, they were also a collective of artists, worked primarily, they sort of kind of united in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and were sort of based in Toronto, this particular group, and did a lot of large scale installation work, very similar to this other collective, Los Carpinteros. And I think you raise a good point, Courtney, too, in that oftentimes when a group or an individual artist is taking a political stance with their work And General Idea certainly did this. They were, yeah, just like you're saying, a lot about the AIDS epidemic and other charged political issues of their day too. Sometimes in the moment, it's very vital and very important, and then over time takes a bit of a different tone. And yeah, I see what you mean about sometimes bold contemporary political pieces don't always wear well. And yeah, and also a great point too that this is done by a collective. So you can see the name of the group here is Los Carpinteros. And so unlike General Idea, who were based in Toronto, Los Carpinteros come out of Havana in Cuba. And they are very inspired, just like many of you have picked up on, by things like architecture and kind of public space in general and areas where lots of people gather. And then also quite interested in the domestic sphere and that contrast between sort of public space and private space. And in some ways that there's a bit of overlap there with the work that General Idea was doing, because they were talking, about sexuality and often intimate details of people's lives and putting that on this public stage. Often, at the AGO, they had a few big happenings and events at the AGO too. One of the things that I find really strikes me with this piece is I tend to associate, bedrooms with kind of intimacy or sleep or sort of a private space. And then of course, amusement parks and roller coasters with something much more wild and loud and very, very public. And so every time I spend time with this piece, that's one of those things that I find a little bit unsettling under the surface. It's like, ooh, it's like, yeah, this kind of really private, calm space with this tumultuous, very loud and public one. And I think if we read into that maybe a little bit more deeply, it could lead us into conversations about, the public and private in politics. Certainly coming from Cuba, these artists were often quite critical of government policies and stances and maybe reach into people's private lives. And I'm curious, maybe this is, probably front of mind for many of us right now, given what we've been through in the recent months, even in this country. But have you seen any evidence, or do you have conversations in your circles about private and public space? One example I can think of is how, you're in my home with me right now. Essentially, there's a picture on the wall behind me, and what used to be a public space, me going into work at the AGO, is now done, from my own private space. So I think that line for many of us has been a bit blurred over the past few years. Any other reflections on this kind of public space, private space? Oh yeah, Margaret here is saying bedrooms have become work offices during the pandemic, so can relate to this blending of private and public during work meetings, for sure. Yeah, and intimate details of each other's lives, right? Often my daughter is sort of running past and asking me to put a shirt on her doll or something like that. Other thoughts? I think one of the major debates that is somewhat ongoing is sort of the reach of government into our private lives, right? If we take Courtney's cue there with General Idea, one of the things that folks were protesting was that homosexuality was illegal, right? And so what people were doing in their own private spaces could be considered against the law. And of course, Trudeau, famously, the other Trudeau, Pierre Elliott, said something like the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. I'm probably paraphrasing that badly, but that kind of line. And certainly we've seen with the trucker protests, how certain people in this country are feeling that maybe government has reached too far and into our private lives and our rights. We have a few other comments here. So Cindy here is saying, I feel like there's a hesitation to venture outside the home to public events. Yeah, so that dynamic, like personally for all of us, is tricky right now, right? And we might have different levels of comfort with. Some of us are ready to go back to a big event at the AGO or a concert or some kind of sports game. Others are, not ready for that at all. Yeah, Courtney has curated her background. I like that too. I think many folks have done that or kind of used their special Zoom things to blur it. Yeah, we've got Nathan here too saying social media is an interesting blend of public and private. Yeah, or the idea of having your data stolen. Yeah, absolutely. So this one was made in 2008. And I think even then, if we sort of, take ourselves back in our imaginations, we probably couldn't have envisioned how much we rely on the internet and computers today compared to 2008. And yeah, how big social media has actually gotten. Evelyn here says, what does the title mean? Great. So La Montana Rusa is actually, it means the Red Mountain, but in Spanish, that's how you say roller coaster. So if you were, at an amusement park in Cuba, let's ride the roller coaster, you'd say, let's ride the Montana Rusa. So it has those two meanings. There's a bit of a double entendre too, I think. Of course, being in Cuba with a communist history and socialist government, there could be some conversations and maybe a slight critique there with respect to with Russia too, and their ways of governing, which again is quite topical this particular week. Yeah, and others are saying, yeah, lockdowns and restrictions. Yeah, so you have a few more angles of this one, just to get a better sense. And one more interesting thing to know about Los Carpinteros as well is that they were deliberately a collective. One of the things they wanted to do, similar to General Idea actually, was to kind of get away from this star system in art. They saw that as being quite damaging and also false. This idea, we take someone like Picasso, a name that many people know, he gets a lot of credit for inventing Cubism or particular styles. And then when you delve a little bit deeper, you say, wait a second, he was borrowing / stealing from a lot of African art that he had and that he saw, and other people around him kind of invented Cubism first. And any artist isn't really creating their work in this silo and in total isolation. And so when they create, they started as a group of 3 and now they're a collective of 2. When they create, they really want to stress that and kind of harken back to an era of craftsmen. And when there would be these guilds and you might work together with someone who has a similar talent but a slightly different perspective on a project and bring your forces together to make something new. And yeah, they're not that interested in sort of getting credit or individual credit for what they create. So let's take a look at this next piece now. This one here is called Don't Breathe, Don't Drink. And it's by an artist named Ruth Cuthand. And again, I'll just start here with initial observations. Another installation piece. So if you were to see it in the gallery, there'd actually be a table and this sort of paneling behind it. Everything you see here is part of the installation itself. I'm going to just zoom in a little bit too, so you get a better view of the cups here. And with work that's conceptual like this, I really love to hear, any thoughts when you look at this, sort of what do you think is going on here? It might also be feelings, maybe something you see here, reminds you of something that you thought about or seen recently. What do folks notice? So we have, okay, so Courtney here saying the oppression of housework done primarily by women. Ah, interesting. Yeah, so maybe this reminds you of kind of a line of dirty dishes or something. Certainly there's lots of baby bottles, so maybe indicating, the care that often women do for others in the domestic sphere.
I see some message of maybe pollution in terms of what we breathe in and what we drink, and I think the baby bottle kind of brings in from the time you're born to being affected to it. So that's what I saw in it. It's pretty deep, so that's the most that I could see.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. So certainly, yeah, interesting dynamic here of like maybe different generations. We've got these baby bottles, so maybe something associated with family. I'm just reading in the chat here. So yeah, maybe a statement on the environment, how air and water are no longer safe. Nicely said. And I see, yeah, and Carol here was also seeing, these reminded her of mops and sort of housework. Yeah, tools that often women use to keep spaces clean. Carol is saying that I think of the pandemic and not wanting to drink from open vessels on a table. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think, and again, this was created in 2016, and little did we know what was on the horizon, but certainly today, I think that's a totally valid response of, oh my goodness, whose cup is this? Where's mine? What's safe? Yeah, and these interesting kind of floating things inside these vessels too. That's really attention grabbing. They're at once kind of really beautiful, and you can, if you look closely, you'll be able to see they're made out of beads, so they're sort of hand beaded here. But also there's a bit of a darkness to them that I'll share more momentarily. Oh, Mindy might be onto something here. Images of bacteria in glasses juxtaposed with baby bottles, which should be sterilized. Yeah, so they do look kind of like wild tropical fish. But also in this particular case, and this, you know, is also associated to that previous comment about our environment and what's safe and what's toxic. These are actually what certain bacteria look like under the microscope. And they aren't just any sort of bacteria, but bacteria found in water on 94 different Indigenous community reserves in this country. So back in 2016, when Ruth Cuthand was making this work, she did her research and she thought, okay, you know, Trudeau's government has been elected. They've made strong statements about caring for Indigenous folks. What's actually happening? And in that year, in 2016, there were actually 94 Native communities who didn't have safe drinking water. And so as part of this work, she looked at these bacteria, these dangerous parasites under the microscope, and then made them much bigger and turned them into these beautiful beaded creatures. And she herself she does have an Indigenous background. She's part Scottish and part Plains Cree. And yeah, decided to make this as a bit of a bigger commentary. So that's the drinking part. And then if we go back here, we can see there's more to it too. One of the things that really inspired this work was when Chief Teresa Spence from Attawapiskat was raising attention to the poor housing conditions on her particular reserve. And she did back in, I think it was 2012, she did that hunger strike on Parliament Hill, and basically was, you know, on a hunger strike protesting until Stephen Harper, who was Prime Minister at the time, would meet with her about it. And so Ruth Cuthand sort of started researching more about these living conditions in these communities and was really struck with how poorly put together a lot of the housing was, how oftentimes there would be black mold in the walls or in the ceiling, and so they'd have to be removed. And often were just replaced with a tarp like this until the construction was finished. And obviously these blue tarps don't do a great job keeping out the elements and keeping people safe. And so, yeah, she was just quite struck with that and wanted to make a piece about this. And this too, it's hard to see on the actual image, but if I were to zoom in here, this is also sort of really beautiful beadwork that does look like kind of mops or maybe some sort of instrument or something. But this is actually also what black mold looks like under the microscope. So these kind of, you know, things that when we first look at them, might think, oh, that's quite beautiful and what beautiful beadwork. And then you dig a little deeper and you think, oh, that's actually sort of toxic and dangerous. So that real juxtaposition there. All right, I'm going to change slides because my colleague Lauren R here has a lot to show us step by step. So we'll go to the art making component here now. There we go.
Okay. All right. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing some stencil work, or I'm going to be doing some stencil work, and you can either follow along or you can try yourself. I just put into chat a couple of links. The word that I'm using is yes. And the reason why I'm using it is because I'm a real Yoko Ono fan. And in fact, I started working at the Age show specifically because of that, the show that we had 20 plus years ago. So what I'm going to do is you might need a healing board, which is the green board, some acetate or Duralar, some stipple brushes, some scissors, maybe an X-Acto knife or a stencil cutter, paper that's thick, paper to paint on, some paint, a lid to put the paint in. And what I might do is just show you a few examples of my work, and then we'll get right into it. So if you want to switch the slide there, Lauren. So I work in the film industry, and the film industry is all about yes. It doesn't matter how much money it costs, you just always have to answer yes to that. So that's partly where it came from. And it's really hard to get to know everybody, especially now with masks. So all of my work shirts have yes somewhere on them, and that helps people know that I'm who I am as opposed to someone else. So these are just using straight acrylic paint. Some I've used a silk screen with a stencil, but most of the time I've been stippling it on just with a paintbrush. And the heart on my sleeve, which is folded in the very top row, is to just remind myself that I need to be kind in my interactions with other people, because sometimes it gets a bit hairy at work, but just in general, you don't know where people are coming from. And so if they're rude to you, that doesn't mean you need to be rude back to them. You can be a bit safer to that. So the next slide is just taking that idea. Right before COVID hit, I actually had made Christmas ornaments that had offered more time and more money. And little did I know we would have a world pandemic that gave us too much time, maybe some money, but not necessarily. So that was one aspect. I always make ornaments to give to other people. But during the pandemic, one of the things I did was I actually put up 38 paintings all over the city that have the word yes in it, on paintings that I didn't sell. And I thought, I don't really need it anymore. And we couldn't go into galleries. So I thought, well, this will be my gift to the city. And so anywhere in High Park or in the East End or near DuPont, there's 38 paintings that say yes. So feel free to try and find them. And the next slide is I take my notion to what the yes is, which is positivity and opening a door. Lauren and I were talking about in theater sports or in theater acting. In fact, it is all about yes. If you say no, what happens is it shuts down the interaction between the two actors. So you always almost have to say yes. So my front stoop says yes, and my cottage has rhinoceroses for me, which are my favorite animal. And just talking about interactions of two people, it's all about the love. So that's sort of what where I'm coming from. And the stencil can be a store-bought stencil, or it can be something that you make yourself. I don't think there's another slide, so maybe we'll quit sharing so that we can switch to my other view here. So I'm gonna put myself in with my webcam just so that you can see what's going on. My face doesn't have the art on it. So I'm using Tupperware plates. They're basically just sour cream container lids with paint. This is probably too much paint, but I wanted you to be able to see the color. There's a couple of types of brushes. So ideally, you want to have a brush that's very flat in this part and that's really stiff. So this is a watercolor brush. It's really, really soft. This is the worst kind of brush to use. So don't use any of your watercolor brushes that are soft. It can be a little bit rounded on the end, but it's better if it's really, really flat. So this is a stencil brush, and I'm going to use that. There's a couple sizes. You could use a box cutter that's small or a box cutter that's big. I tend to like using a stencil cutter, which is very pointy and it's really good at turning. If you have a cutter that is not very sharp, there's a couple things you can do. One is you can use aluminum foil and just cut the aluminum foil with your blade, and that will kind of give it a little bit more of an edge. Doesn't work all the time, but it does help. And with something like a box cutter, you would just snap off the blade like that so that it's nice and sharp. So a brand new blade is kind of an important part, or a sharp blade. And then scissors, I like using tiny scissors because I'm kind of doing tiny work. So if you do embroidery or any sewing, those kinds of scissors are good. And in terms of working on the material, there's a couple things that you can do. You can have an idea that you've printed out on your computer, and you could potentially just cut that letter out. And so I'm just going to cut out an I right here. So it's super easy because I'm just tracing something that already existed. With paper, the challenge with that is that you can't really use this stencil more than once. Like you can use it in one sitting, and then afterwards it kind of gets all mucked up over time, and it doesn't have a lot of wear and tear ability. So for myself, if I know I'm only going to do something once, then I will cut it out. But if I know I'm pretty keen on the idea, then the odds are I'm going to use an X-Acto knife and a piece of Duralar, because this isn't going to last. So I don't want to keep this part. I want to keep this part. So the innie is the important part. And because I've cut into it, I'm actually going to tape that little bit off just so that it's not going to fall apart on me, because I don't want to have a line where I've stenciled. If you're going to use acetate, the thing that's really great about it is it's really strong. It'll probably take 40,000 years to biodegrade. So, you know, it's not that great for the environment, but it is really great for stencil making. And so I've got 2 letters left here that I'm going to cut out. And I'm going to use this. I'm going to use 2 different tools. I'm going to try this one and this one. I find I really like using a sharp blade. So sometimes if my blade is just not sharp enough, even though this is a better tool to be working with, I find that I don't want to have to score it twice. And the way you can tell is if you're actually cutting and it's not going all the way through, then maybe it's not that sharp. So this is not as sharp as I'd like it to be. So I've just snapped this off so I know it's good to go. And so I'm going to use that instead. And I'm using a healing board is one way of working, but the problem with the healing board is you can't see what you're doing with the transparency because it's clear. So I just use the back end of an old sketchbook, especially when they're really nice and tough cardboard.
Lauren, can you just clarify, what is a healing board?
A healing board is it's a piece of plastic that is flexible. And the thing is that when you cut into it, it doesn't actually make grooves in it. Whereas this has some grooves in it. So if I was cutting into wood, the wood grain would be my problem. It would keep wanting me to follow the wood grain. This, after a while, is going to have so many pieces cut out of it that it might have divots in it or little tiny areas where my knife will want to go. So the healing board is a better method. You can get them at the dollar store for literally $1, but they are hard to see. So that's one of the reasons why I am not using it, just so that you can see what it is that I'm doing. And as I'm cutting, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm actually using my finger to hold it in place, because if I don't want to slip and cut myself, but I also don't want to have the acetate moving on me as I'm cutting. And this is important. If your blade is not sharp, it might not cut it very well, or it might slip. So basically you want to just cut all the way around. And I tend to not move my hand so much as the actual piece of paper or mylar that I'm cutting out, because of carpal tunnel syndrome. I don't want to have my hand or wrist get too tired out too quickly. So you hope to get it all the way around. And this is where scissors are kind of handy, because they can do a pretty good job of cutting out very quickly. The problem is that this stuff is so stiff that it's hard to get the scissors in there. So I'm going to start by creating a hole in this, and then I'm going to use scissors to cut this S out. And so it's a question of having to move this a lot to be able to get in there. So, all right. And depending on where you're cutting, you might have to be a bit strategic with how you cut it. If it's really tricky and finite work, I might actually cut into the letter itself, which I know I'm not going to need, and then score away at it so that it's not a whole piece in the end. And that's a good strategy. But the thing is that if you have lots of little pieces, then it's harder to get those little edges afterwards. And so I find I do better work by doing it all in one piece.
Lauren, I assume if someone, would rather do a symbol or something that means something to them instead of a word, that would be just fine too, right?
Right. Yeah, it could be a word. It could be an image. I do a lot of hearts because I think that there needs to be more love everywhere. And the thing is that if, in terms of picking your word, capital letters tend to be easier to do than small letters. But the other aspect is that you don't want to have pieces that are floating inside it. So in my capital A, I have a triangle. And in my capital R, I have a little tiny semicircle. And so the challenge is that what do I do with this space? So one of the things that you can do is you can just cut tape out and use that for your floater, which is the part inside, or you can decide not to use it. Some stencils, like these ones, these are just store-bought stencils. They'll have pieces holding it all together like flanges. And these are cardboard. They're not that expensive. You can get them at the hardware store. They come in all different sizes, but they're very classic sort of stencil lettering font. I've been using these guys for quite a long time now. And the challenge is that you can't wash them, right? So, and I tape them together because I know I'm going to have the same message pretty much all the time. So you can do something like that if you know you want to have a word, and you can put them together, and that works out pretty well. So after you've cut them out, whether that's a piece of paper or a piece of Duralar or acetate or Mylar or hard rigid card, then the next step is to do the painting part of it. So you can use all different kinds of paper. You can use fabric. You can put it on bags. You can put it on clothing. And one of the things I like to do is I like to sort of set up where I think things should go. So ahead of time, I had already put in, and I'm going to turn this around so that it's the right way around. I had actually put in lines just in pencil really lightly. Maybe it's too light. I'm hoping you can see it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put in my floater bits in this part. And then in terms of paint, you don't want to have this much paint going on. And I just want to make sure that you can see what I'm doing. So I just have to change my view here, speaker view. There we go. Okay. So you don't want to have a big, huge gob of paint. You want to have sort of a smaller amount of paint. So depending on if you want to have something that's all one color, or if you want to change colors, I usually have more than one color in front of me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush and I'm just going to put just a little bit on a flat so that it's really, really flat. So it's not too lumpy. And I'm just testing it out a little bit. And so what I want to have is not tons of paint here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push straight down. Push straight down onto the paper, and I'm tamping it down. Now, you can decide to have hardly any paint so that it's really, really light. And true stencil painting tends to be this light. But because I want to really get a nice, strong image and lots of contrast, I'm putting quite a bit of paint on.
Lauren,
Now, yes.
we actually were able to see your paint, but not what you're actually
Oh,
doing.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Okay, thank you for pointing that out. So, okay, so you want to have your paintbrush fully loaded, but not too goopy. You can test it out on the palette, and you're basically just putting your paintbrush straight down, and you're not pushing down really hard. You're trying to keep it quite stiff. And the reason why you don't want to go sideways is because you don't want to get it underneath the stencil. And the type of paint I'm using is actually heavy body medium paint. So it's not a liquid golden paint. It's more of a in a bucket or in a tube. So tube paint will work, bucket paint will work. But paint that is very, very liquidy will not work. It will want to go underneath. So if you wanted to go from one color to another, what you would need to do is you could either switch out your brush, which is the best strategy, or what you could do is you can have hardly any paint on your brush and just pull out another one, another color, and then it will transition to the next color. And if you want it to kind of blend in, then sometimes it's a good idea to have two separate brushes, just so that you can be a little bit more thoughtful about it. So you'd be more heavy-handed at the bottom, and then as you're transitioning into the next color, you would have less paint. And so you can kind of be a bit fancy with that.
And Lauren, we had a question in the chat from Cindy. Is acrylic paint washable? Like if someone were to do this on a t-shirt?
Right. So this is acrylic paint. So once it dries, it will never come off of your clothing. And so what I'll do is I might just switch out into another material here. So I've put a stencil on a big bag, and one of the things I've done is I have a board inside it so that it's pulling it quite taut, and I could go in and use and so this is one of my larger stencils. I could go in and use paint directly onto this. You can see it kind of moves, it bounces a little bit, so you do have to kind of hold it in place. But absolutely, this paint is acrylic paint, so it is permanent. You could potentially use house paint too, but it tends to be a bit too runny. And with the fabric, the thing that's important is that you pull the fabric really taut. So if you're doing, say, a shirt, the bigger the cardboard in between and the stiffer it is, the better. And the other thing that's important is that you want to have cardboard in between so that the paint doesn't bleed into the other side of the bag or the t-shirt. And basically what will happen is once it's dry, you can go ahead and wash it, and I mean, over time it might crack a little bit. I've got another shirt that I'm working on too, and I've already got a design on it. So I'll pull that out just so that you can see. So with this t-shirt, what I did was, this is a work shirt, and I've taped it so that it's the board is totally inside the shirt. And I wanted to make sure that the sleeves were not in the way. And I wanted to also make sure that it was not wrinkly on this side, because once you start doing this, you don't really want to have to worry about any of the pieces. So for this particular piece, when I did the heart part of it, I just got a piece of paper and folded it in half and cut out that shape, because I needed a bigger heart than what I had in terms of my stencils. So I'm not keeping this part, I'm keeping this part. And I just basically put this down. Okay, this is a little bit bigger than the other one. I just put that down, and you can see that it is kind of, there's a little bit of movement in terms of cracking and things. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of redo it. And this isn't exactly the same as the other one, but it's pretty close. So using a new paintbrush because I don't want to take the time to get another one. And this is gold as opposed to bronze. And so with a rounder paintbrush, what you wind up doing is you just wind up putting it and rolling it a little bit because the brush is going to do it a little bit differently. So, and this color may or may not show up. So I know when I did it before, I had to be really heavy-handed with the paint and be quite thick with it. And the challenge is if it's a transparent color, when you're putting the paint on, if you are going really thick with it, like kind of really thick and goopy, it could kind of flake off or kind of break off, but it's not, it generally will stay on pretty much the whole time. So it's just a question of being really thin layers of paint and going over it a few times, and it should turn out all right. So, I mean, you could potentially just take the paint and just brush it, but you just have to make sure that if you do brush it, you're always working from the edge of the paper into the stencil. And the problem is that if you're not holding the stencil and the paper or the fabric, it'll pull a little bit. I don't know if you can tell that it is tugging a little bit, like this part's tugging. And so it's moving and I don't really want it to move. So that's why it's better to just work straight down. But depending on what it is you're doing and how impatient you are, I'm a very impatient person, so I almost always rush it. So yeah, so it pulled a little bit. So I have a couple of areas here that are just not as perfect as I'd like them to be. And I could potentially just take a brush and go ahead and fix it. But I wanted to put in the stencil that I had just cut out and use it on top of this, just because I wanted to have art is not just art, or not just yes. So it's just a question of taking the word and lining it up. And I do want to have the little floaty bits in there because I really want it to look like separate letter, like real full finished letters. So I always make extra little inny bits because they tend to not make it to a next piece of paper. And so that's what stencil work is kind of like. If you ever want to sign up for a printmaking class, Silkscreen does this much more quickly and elegantly because it is simply putting it through a screen and then squeegeeing through the stencil. And it takes, literally a minute as opposed to 10 minutes. But I figure you might not have stencils and silk screens and things like that at home and squeegees. This is a much more accessible way of making ideas with a stencil.
Lauren, I wonder, since we just have a few minutes left, maybe
Yes.
if anybody has questions, you can type them into the chat. And also we'd love to see some of what you've been making.
Yeah, if you have been, for sure. That's a great idea. Thank you, Lauren. It's easy to get caught up in what you're doing. Yeah.
Anyone care to turn on their camera and share? It's also okay if, Lauren's old hand at this, and so she's working quickly, but if you're just still in the process of cutting out your stencil, that's fine too. We'd love to see the word you've chosen or whatever image or symbol you'd like to work with. If you don't have the materials and you're just watching today and gonna do this later, that's okay too. We'd still love to hear maybe what you're considering making and what word might mean something to you.
Yeah. So if you do have a message that you think, if you could share something on a t-shirt or to the rest of the world, or even just to us, what would be that word or phrase? And we would love to know what that would be.
That's what I've been working on. I have
Oh, nice. That's great.
Thanks. I had a little bit of Mylar that I cut out. I mean, I just used scissors, so mine certainly wasn't as perfect as yours.
Oh, but that's great. Yeah. And it's fun when it's kind of connected, but not connected, like having the spaces is good. So you can cut out the floaters with the acetate. It's just the problem is the acetate's clear and I tend to not be able to find them. So I tape them onto, in this, I have little tiny pieces of tape here that basically say circle for the R or the triangle for the A, and they're going to live underneath there. But I immediately lost 2 of them. So I thought, well, I know this is going to be problematic. But yes, you can totally float them in with acetate. The other thing I put into the chat was a couple of links. So the Yoko Ono's yes statement and her work that kind of got me inspired into using the word yes is there, as well as a link to a video of a book that I had drawn for a drawing challenge that is just basically all about yes and positivity. And so feel free to look at those. You can cut and paste them into your email if you want, or click onto them before the class ends. Thank you for joining us. And if you do have things you want to share, we would love to see what you've got going on. That would be great.
Even if you don't have anything you want to share. Yeah, go ahead.
This is Evelyn again. I guess I'm still confused about why not just cut out the counters for the R and the A. Like, why do we need floaters? Is it just too small a space?
Well, the thing is you don't have to have floaters. You could do it like this, where you have things connected, like the R space could have a line through it if you want. But the thing is that if you wanted to not have this extra line in here, then this will be a floater and the O will have a floater in it. It's not connected. You can make it connected by having a little bridge. You can totally do that so that it's connected to the larger piece, but I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to have the A really have that nice white spot in the triangle of the A and the R. So
I agree. It's not connected. I wasn't thinking, but right in that example, is it just too tight a space to cut out?
No. I mean, I have it cut out. It's just you can't see it because it's so tiny that it's a little teeny tiny triangle. So I thought, for camera viewing.
Oh, now I got it.
Might not like, can you see it? It's right there.
Yeah. Now I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for camera viewing, and also just because after a while, they're still connected to my surface, which is great. I'll take them off now. And then you'll be able to see that. Hopefully, yeah, there we go. So it's kind of a bit snazzier when you take those off, right?
Yeah, and we've got Pat here sharing hers also. Yes.
Let's see. Oh, wow. Nice. Yeah. So if
I'm really into these watercolor crayons these days. Yeah, I love them. Yeah.
Oh, they're so fun. Yeah. And you can dip them in water, or you can use them and then wet them, or.
Yeah, they're great. I love them.
Yeah, so many choices with those, for sure. And blending.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Check it out.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's kind of neat. Is it an painted embroidery?
Well, it was supposed to be a rose, but it didn't turn out very well. So I painted a little around the edges.
Right.
And
so you might have needed the opposite part. You might have needed the innie as opposed to the outie.
well, I don't know. I pressed pretty hard.
Yeah.
But, the center part all came out with the stencil.
Yeah.
It's just that it was too intricate to cut everything properly.
Right. Well, then it's also to deciding, is it the shadow between the petals, or is it the petals that you want, right? That's
yeah.
Yeah, no, it reads as a rose for sure.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Oh, that's fun. Oh, I love it, Marcia.
Yeah. Small, but finished.
Yes. And hearts are easy to do with paper, right?
Actually,
What I used was the lid, the actual lid of, the tub.
Oh,
Cut
okay.
it out from that. So it wasn't so hard.
Yeah, well, and also your M could have been folded too, right? And you could have, because it's symmetrical.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very
other
nice.
ways. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I'm glad people are actually getting to do it. Oh, neat. Oh, hello, Susan. That's great. Yeah, so you have a floater in the middle, but you decided to have the thing attached. Very clever.
Bridge. Yeah.
Yeah, good job.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. I really am appreciating the work that you've created here. And
Thank you.
we do this every month, and so do come back, because the Lauren and Lauren show is turning out to be pretty.
It's a pretty good show.
It is. It's great.
Oh, good. Well, and
Lots
thank you
of fun.
so much for
Lots of fun.
Good. And thank you so much for bringing your own art with it too. And if you didn't get it done, or want to work on it more, or want to post it and share it, if you put it on AGO, hashtag AGO makes or hashtag AGO Toronto, it'll actually be posted on our website and in videos in and around the gallery. So you could be represented in the AGO, which is everybody's dream as artists.
Lauren, I did graffiti.
Oh, nice one. Look at that, Camille. Nice.
Oh, wow. Oh, neat. Very fun. That's super trippy, Camille. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Okay, you take care,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you so much,
Bye.
everyone.